Welcome again to the IEEFA Energy Finance Conference and this panel session on carbon capture and sequestration. Carbon capture presupposes carbon release. It's proposed for coal plants, natural gas-based blue hydrogen, and a variety of industrial processes. And some also propose to remove carbon directly from the atmosphere. What are its potential uses? What are its limitations? What are its complications? What do we need to know to decide whether it's a reasonable alternative for any given need? And is the public being told the full truth? Today, we're going to hear from three experts. Dennis Wamsted is an energy analyst for IEEFA with expertise in electric power production. He's tracked utility transitions and technological developments for over 30 years. Previously, he served as executive editor of the Energy Daily, which is a leading trade publication based in Washington, D.C. He was there for 7 years. He is also a consultant for utilities and industry on technology and policy trends. He graduated with honors from Harvard University, and he's a Fulbright scholar. Putra Adhiguna is an energy analyst for IEEFA based in Asia who focuses on energy transition in the context of emerging economies. He analyzes energy investments and technology shifts in both the power and transportation sectors. He has held leadership positions in Fortune 500 companies. He holds an engineering degree from the Institute Technologie Bandung and a master in public policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Shannon Anderson serves as staff attorney and organizer for the Powder River Basin Resource Council in Wyoming, where carbon capture has become a highly debated issue. She battles the impacts of coal and uranium mining, as well as power plants. She also provides legal and strategic support to communities facing oil and gas environmental problems. She's a graduate of Grinnell College, and she received her law degree, cum laude, from Lewis and Clark Law School. After their presentations, we will invite questions, and again, you'll be asked to use the microphone so that people can hear you and tell us your name and where you're from before your question. So let's get started.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to applaud all of you for sticking it out through the end of the day. It's been a very long day for all of us. And we were going to end this session by just saying carbon capture doesn't work and it's not financially viable, but we do all have presentations. So we're going to go through them really quickly, and we hope to get to questions at the end. But my presentation is going to be U.S. focused, and Putra will be taking the international approach. The U.S., as I think many of you know, has in the past 2 years passed two massive energy, carbon capture, renewable bills with billions and billions of dollars earmarked for a variety of projects. And for those of you who were not in the previous session on hydrogen, we did have a comment to the effect that a lot of stupid things get built in the United States. And it's entirely possible that we're going to have a lot of other stupid things at least proposed to get funding going forward here. As you can see on the first slide here, I've outlined a whole bunch of dollars that are earmarked in the legislation that passed last year, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act of 2021. And you may also have seen just recently the Department of Energy has come out with basically its call for applications for all of this money. And it's tens of, well, it might be $10 billion, it might be 12 billion, it depends on how you add it all up. But it is a lot of money, and industry is going to be applying, and the rule going forward here is that the money's there, DOE is going to want to spend it. That doesn't mean the project has to get built, but there will be applications, and it will be something that I think all of us in this room will be looking at and going, you know what, that just doesn't make any sense. But so the current landscape is actually building on what was passed in 2021. We also have what was just passed 2 months ago, which was the poorly named Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. The very important thing for all of you to know about that, of course, is that the tax credits or the 45Q credits were greatly enhanced in this new piece of legislation with the incentive for capturing carbon up from $50 to $85 a ton if you inject it underground, and if you use it for enhanced oil recovery, it went up from $35 to $60 a ton. There's also a new credit for direct air capture. I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to direct air capture in my presentation. I think it could be something 20 years from now. It's not going to be anything that's going to do anybody any good in the next 10 years. And to me, with the hydrogen presentations we heard earlier, it's a distraction at the moment, and it's not, I think, where we need to focus our attention. One of the things I do want to draw your attention to is the last bullet point in the slide here. There was some changes in the bill that actually could lead to people getting paid to capture carbon, but emissions from the plant going up, which seems like an oxymoron or counterintuitive or however you want to phrase it. But the way the legislation is written, you have to design your carbon capture facility to be able to capture 75% of the carbon emitted from it. It doesn't mean you actually have to capture the 75%. So if you had a plant that wasn't producing a lot of electricity and then you went back and retrofitted it with something designed to capture 75%, it won't necessarily capture 75%, but if it captures a little bit and you up the generation from the facility, you're essentially getting paid to pollute. And it's something that everybody should pay attention to going forward. And, of course, as no one here will be surprised, with all that money floating around, there are still a lot of people out there that think carbon capture is a wonderful idea. One of the projects we carefully follow at IEEFA is in New Mexico by a company called Enchant Energy that wants to buy for $1 the San Juan generating station and retrofit 2 of the units there that are now closed, but open them up again, retrofit them with carbon capture, and then turn to the federal government to collect their 45Q tax credits. They estimate that for this particular plant, which would be about 850 megawatts, it would cost $1.6 billion to retrofit it, and they would only be able to clean up 500 megawatts of the generation. And just economically, it makes absolutely no sense, but there are people out there betting on the fact that they can collect these tax credits to recover their investment and make a little bit of money. Up in North Dakota, there's another project by a cooperative which wants to also, it's a very small facility, I forget it, it's like 600 megawatts at the Milton R. Young coal plant, and they want to spend about $1.5 billion to retrofit it to capture carbon. Obviously, this is misplaced investment. There are also ongoing what we call FEED studies, which are front-end engineering and design studies underway at a number of other big coal plants around the United States. And those could turn into the applications that I mentioned earlier for the funding going forward from the Jobs Act. There are going to be proposals, and there are going to be, hopefully there are going to be fights about whether this should be done or shouldn't be done. And we'll be able to convince people that economically it doesn't make sense to finance it, and from an environmental perspective, it doesn't make sense to try to capture that carbon. While there are people still in favor of carbon capture, there have been mumbles and rumbles around about people who are opposed to carbon capture, especially on coal-fired power plants. This quote is from the current, essentially fossil energy deputy secretary. This was from last year before the Jobs Act was passed, but basically she seems to be running toward other options for carbon capture, not on coal-fired power plants. And then these are from the utility industry, two of which I really, really like. But Jeffrey Lyash is the president of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which has a series of its own problems with nuclear and lack of renewables generation. But he has basically said that's just not something we're ever going to consider at TVA, and they have a lot of coal-fired capacity there. And then just recently, I think Shannon will probably touch on this a little bit later, but a spokesperson for the Pacificor in Wyoming said that they've examined carbon capture in all of their resource planning documents, and it just doesn't pencil out. And they don't want to do it. They're being forced in Wyoming, and I won't jump into Shannon's story as we go forward here. That's coal. I think one of the big issues going forward is going to be what happens on the gas-fired sector in the United States. We have 280,000 megawatts, more or less, of installed combined cycle gas facilities in the U.S. right now, with a little bit more, in the planning process. Not a lot, but there is a little bit more in the queue. That's an awful lot of our generation, and it has been providing 37, 38% of the electricity in the U.S. over the past few years. There's a lot of people in the gas industry and the fossil fuel industry that want to be able to install carbon capture on all of those plants, or at least a large percentage of those plants, and keep them running and trying to capture the carbon. I think that's where a lot of the fight's going to be going forward. The thing to take away from this presentation is that carbon capture has never been done on a large gas-fired or combined cycle gas plant anywhere in the world. There was a 50 megawatt one that ran in Massachusetts for 15 years. It actually ran pretty successfully, and they shut it down because they were done with the demonstration. But at a 600 megawatt or 900 megawatt or even bigger gas-fired plant, this has not been done. So nobody can come up to you and say, oh, this will work. It'll work at 100%, and they'll capture 95% of the carbon, and it'll all be good to go. It's going to come up as a fight, and it's something to get prepared for. There are a number of FEED studies underway right now at gas-fired power plants in the U.S., and there is money in the Jobs Act that would fund two full-scale commercial demonstration projects. So that is about to hit the fan, if you will, going forward. Hydrogen, we had a long conversation about that. I won't go into this much, but there are clearly different colors. We all know what the colors are. We all know that blue is bad and green is good, so we can move on from there. But in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are credits for hydrogen production. And unfortunately, what Professor Horwath was saying about leakage and all that is, I think, 100% true, but that's not the numbers that are being used by the Department of Energy to calculate these credits. They're calculating a much lower leakage rate, and they're using the 100-year time frame for impact on the environment instead of the 20-year time frame. So it's possible that some gas plants will be able to qualify for this credit here. It'll be close, and if they qualify, it'll be for one of the lesser credits, the 75-cent credit, not the $3 credit. I also do think it's possible that this will, maybe unintended, but this will lead to the production of a bunch of pink hydrogen, because there is a production tax credit for nuclear power in the bill, and they also can take advantage of this hydrogen production credit here. So it makes using your nuclear power plant to produce hydrogen a little more economically feasible. That said, about carbon capture, I think the real issue for us at IEEFA, and hopefully for you guys, is to understand how incredibly cheap renewables have gotten over the past 10 years. You hear these numbers all the time, but it just, when you see it in a chart, I think it gives a little bit more, oomph to it. The thing in this chart that really got me, and the reason I included it, is at the very top right of the chart, at that top part of the blue line, that's where gas prices are right now. Essentially $6.50 a million BTUs. So skip the long, straight blue line in there where the EIA folks were estimating gas prices were going to be into the future. We've blown past that, and we've made renewables cheaper than anything out there, and we have very accessible and readily available storage. So the argument is not to retrofit a carbon facility or a coal facility or a gas facility with carbon capture, but to look at this kind of chart and say, listen, we have better, cleaner, cheaper options right now, and they're just sitting there waiting for us to use them. This is another just quickie little look at the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. Two things to take away from this is that there was already going to be a huge build-out of renewables in the U.S., and then the two circled items on the right are the estimate from Rystad Energy about the growth in wind and solar by the end of the decade, and it amounts to about 130 gigawatts of new capacity just from this legislation. The important thing from that is just we haven't begun to see the impact of this legislation. Obviously, it was passed 2 months ago. So quick conclusions. 4 years ago, when I did my first big report for IEEFA, we tackled carbon capture on coal-fired power plants, and that was the title, Holy Grail of Carbon Capture Eludes the Coal Industry. They have made no progress in 4 years, and it continues to elude them. They're not getting closer. It doesn't work for a 90% capture every day for 15 years, 20 years, however long you depends. It will not work in that fashion, and they're not making progress toward making it work in that fashion. For gas-fired, I think, to be honest with you, I think the verdict is still out. We don't really know if we're going to be able to come up with a way to capture carbon from big power plants that are installed in the U.S. going forward. There's a lot of research being done on it. I'm very leery/skeptical of the ability to do this, but given the size of the installed resource base, that's where I'm going to be focusing my attention going forward, seeing what's being done, how it's being done, if it works. It doesn't work for blue hydrogen, but conceivably it could work on a power plant. Not today, and even the research that's being done now, GE and the other turbine folks, they say they can have these facilities built, but not until about 2030. And so that's a big part of the problem when we have 8 years of continued emissions from these gas plants and these coal plants. Hydrogen doesn't work. We solved that problem in our last session, so we don't need to worry about that. But I would emphasize what Suzanne said at the panel before. We are very, very leery of the market opportunities for any kind of hydrogen. We think it's been totally overblown, and so there isn't the need for blue hydrogen. There might be the need for green hydrogen going forward. And I will leave you with the last thing, perhaps the most important thing. Pipelines are an issue that nobody has talked about. I work with a couple of groups out in the Midwest now who are opposing the ethanol pipeline build-out proposals where they're shipping or want to ship CO2 from ethanol production facilities out to sequestration sites in South Dakota and North Dakota. And people are really, really opposed. And it's a very interesting coalition because it's a group of environmental activists and it's a group of farmers. And they don't naturally go together. And they have come together to oppose these pipelines. And it's a very interesting dynamic and something I think that will bear watching. But the reason I bring it up is because if anybody wants to really go down the road toward carbon capture in the U.S., there's a huge number of pipelines that have to be built. And I think that is probably the Achilles heel of this whole issue for the fossil fuel industry, because I don't think the pipelines can be built. And with that, I think I will bring it to a close and turn it over to Putra.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks for sticking around. I only got 4 slides, but hopefully I can get through in 15 minutes. So before you start, I want to just 3 numbers that you can take away with, right? First is 1930. That's the first patent for the carbon capture that was ever registered. And the technology has been a little bit improved here and there, but 1930 was when it all started. So Bruce earlier, my colleague, mentioned that it started in 1970s. So that's your second numbers. So 1970s when it's all began, when the world started to capture a lot of carbon, a lot is under quotation mark. And lastly is that zero gas power plant. Despite all the talks, despite all the discussion, I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic than Dennis. We've seen a lot of progress on the coal, but there's only one plant that's operating globally today, and there's zero for gas. So it remains to be seen whether the United States will be able to pick that up soon. So today I'll be picking up a few topics, but mostly talking about the power and gas. My colleague Bruce talks about the gas sector and the CCS. And sometimes it's a bit easy for us to become a bit confused. So what's the difference between all this? And secondly, it's about Asia. So next slide, please. Oh, I had to click it, sorry. All right, so Asia. The map that you're seeing on the screen, for those of you coming from the States, maybe a little bit, it's far away. But those are a bit dated map coming from 2016 about LNG transportations. Far before anybody here talks about LNG, Asia has always been the key part of LNG. Japan practically invented and grew the LNG sector, and then Australia picks up and so forth. Why is this relevant for this case? It's because the big giant of LNG, Japan and also China, but primarily Japan, the way they think about emissions, they're thinking as an island. Japan practically imports all of their energy. And when they talk about reducing emissions, they need to store it somewhere. So when they think about importing energies, they're thinking about how do we reduce emissions? Let's capture it. The problem is Japan doesn't have a lot of place to store it. Therefore, they're already thinking ahead about exporting those CO2 emissions. So this is something that we need to keep in the back of our mind when we talk about other regions, such as Asia. Because what they're planning to do is they invented LNG, and now they're going to be part of the new economy. The new economy can be hydrogen, ammonia, it can be liquid CO2, and they're trying to be ahead of the curve. So what you're seeing is that there's a push growing in Asia and various parts of Southeast Asia about carbon capture, whether it's Malaysia, here and there. So all kinds of stories from industrial products and so forth. So that is basically what's happening in the other part of carbon capture. Now, whenever we hear about carbon capture, I think Bruce, again, my colleague earlier already highlighted, most of the capacity of carbon capture comes from the gas sector. Whenever we hear about carbon capture, it's so easy for us to be distracted to think about it's the power sector. It's going to be the gas. It's going to be the coal sector. It's not. It has always been the gas production. Now, let me give you a bit of analogy. So suppose you have two neighbors, right? I mean, two houses. One generates a bit more waste, house waste. And then they need to put more garbage bin. They need to pay more to get that garbage out. Does it make the second household cleaner? I don't think so. So that's the basic logic of the gas industry. So what you have is that on average, suppose you have this percentage of CO2 and most of the gas in the world. Some of the gas has more CO2 within them. What our colleagues in Australia has, they got the Barossa field, which has 18% of gas. That is like 3, 4, 5 times the normal amount of gas in CO2. Now, on many Southeast Asian countries, we're seeing a lot of CO2 within the gas reserves. Some are 30%, some are 40%, some are 70%. And yes, people are talking about this. And who's the sponsor behind it? Obviously, each country wants to produce it. But also there's a big push from the Japanese side and many other countries that's trying to drive the discussion. So again, when we look at global view, the gas sector, when they produce the gas, the CCS has always been the story. And then if we look at Southeast Asian context, if you look at the graph on the right side, you can see that 3/4 of the plan of CCS for the next 2 decades in Southeast Asia is for gas production. So it's irrelevant, so to say. It's irrelevant because most of their emissions comes from the power sector, transport, and so forth. But most of the CCS plan is coming from the gas sector. Now, so again, it's easy to conflate the discussion about power, gas, because each of this has a very specific characteristic. I hope you can see a bit of what's on the screen. Pay attention to what's on the left side. Just pay attention on the vertical axis. That's the cost of carbon capture for each different applications. Now, it's so easy for us to look at carbon capture because it's called the same. The term is the same, carbon capture. But within it, you actually have so many types of carbon capture, depending on how you applied it, whether you applied it for the gas production, coal power plant, cement sector, steel, each of this runs at a different cost. And if you notice, the one with the yellow box, that's the gas production. It's very cheap. So the reason you have a lot of CCS globally today, it's because amongst the different varieties, it's the one that's easier to be achieved. Why is it easier? Because usually you get a lot of CO2 in high concentration. As you move into more difficult applications, like the coal power, you get less CO2s on the exhaust, so it's a bit more expensive, and then even less so for the gas. Again, as the United States try to pick up what's the future for the gas-powered CO2, I think it remains an open question, but that question has not been able to be answered for the last 30 to 40 years. On the right side, you see a case of Petronova. I'm sure everybody knows about this case. $1 billion for a 240 megawatt power plant. Now, if those of you are familiar with the cost of power plant, that's more than the cost of the power plant. So to add into what Dennis has been saying, when you have the deflationary cost of the renewables, basically what we're trying to do now is trying to add more and more costs into the existing assets, whether it's a gas plant or coal plants. The use of the CCS in the hard-to-abate sector may be potential, whether it's cement, but the use in the power sector will likely become difficult. This is my last slide. It's so complicated sometimes to understand carbon capture. What I'd like you guys to at least try to understand it easily is that when you have a coal plant or a gas plant and then you emit 1 million tons of CO2, and then you need to pay a few $100 times such million tons, what you're paying is essentially a carbon tax. So CCS is, in a sense, a carbon tax. So for those markets who doesn't have any carbon tax, there may be some incentives differently, like the US is implying a carbon credit, tax credit, and so forth. But in general, when you try to understand carbon capture, it's basically a carbon tax. So if there's a lot of difficult talks about getting a carbon tax of $100, well, we need to get used to it if that's the plan forward, because CCS was never been cheap. Secondly, is that whoever is going to pay for this is going to be the consumers, it's going to be the export market for products, and whether it's corporations and so forth. Now, point number 2 is the long trail of public funding. The US has spent with at least $1 billion of subsidies and support and grants, and today there is zero power application in CCS. And the same thing has happened in the EU region. They've spent at least €500 million euros, and they have not seen a light of day. Now, right now, there is a lot of talks about introducing what is called the carbon capture hub. This is going to be the next move that's coming. The EU is trying to do this in several countries like UK and Norway. But keep in mind that this is also backstopped by a lot of money from the government. Norway, example, 2/3 of the project cost is borne by the government. And this is Norway. And as we know, that is a country which has one of the highest carbon tax in the world. And even that, they still need to have a lot of support for CCS. So that's still going to be the big question of what's going to happen in the CCS carbon hub. And lastly, some of my colleagues may disagree on this, but I guess to put a little bit of positive note, more money may eventually reduce the amount of cost for the CCS. But how long will it take? We don't know. IEA gives an estimate for coal plants. It's going to be $40 in 2070 per ton of CO2. That is a long time, and maybe it's irrelevant by that time. But the point is that as many countries start pouring money into these facilities, there is a possibility that there can be some cost reduction. But how much and how soon, that's going to be the biggest question. That's remain an open question. The high cost of failure is important to note. What I mean by this is that a single CCS plant, like we saw in Petronova, cost $1 billion. Now, the picture there gives you an example that if you want to build a wind turbine, each costing $2 to $5 million, and you can fine-tune the design over time. Over decades, you can try to fine-tune it. If your trial run costs you a few $100 million or a few $1 billion, it's going to take a long time and a lot of convincing people. Because what essentially going to take place is that you will have a lot of failed projects. You will have a lot of public funds or corporate money, whoever's going to pay until the CCS is going to succeed. So again, all of these are an open question, but so far from what we can see in the history of CCS, it's been pretty sketchy. So I'm going to pass it over to my next colleague to talk about from the Powder River Basin. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Shannon again from Wyoming. It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll promise I'll wrap up, and then we can have a good question and answer, and you can all enjoy the evening here in New York. So I have a story to tell you about my state of Wyoming. And this is a picture of the Dave Johnson Power Plant, which is located outside a town called Glen Rock. Very small community down the road from a town called Casper, which is one of the largest communities in our state. It has about 55,000 people. So raging metropolis for my home state of Wyoming, which has only 550,000 people in the entire state. And I have the pleasure of working for an organization called the Powder River Basin Resource Council. We're just celebrating our 50th year of existence in the state. We work with community members who are largely impacted by extraction, coal, oil and gas, other fossil fuels, uranium, transmission lines, pipelines, you name it. And I have been working there roughly 15 years now to really focus in on how we can move our state forward, how we can kick the fossil fuel curse, and really start to transition to renewable energy. And unfortunately, carbon capture and coal, trying to save coal has really been a false promise narrative in my state that's been dominating kind of the political sphere at the legislature and in the governor's mansion. And here's why. So we are a large coal state. We actually produce more coal than the next 7 states combined in the United States. So roughly 40% of U.S. coal production comes from my state. This means jobs, it means revenue, and all kinds of revenue. So there's state revenue through state severance taxes. We get a lot of federal revenue because the coal we produce in Wyoming is federally owned. It's actually owned by you and me as American taxpayers, if you are one. And we also get local revenue that funds our school system. So if you come to my state, you'll see actually very nice schools, largely funded through coal. And, like everywhere, coal production in Wyoming has declined significantly, roughly cut in half from peak production in 2008. But roughly cut in half in Wyoming means about 200 million tons of coal a year. So we're still producing significant amounts of coal, and that, of course, means in terms still revenue and jobs, definitely reduced from what it was at peak, but still there. So again, as it kind of decreases more and more, there's extra incentive from the political sphere to save what's left and keep that going as long as possible. Here's a map from the Energy Information Administration. If you're out in the audience and you work on a local coal plant issue in your community, check this map. You might have roots back to Wyoming from where the coal actually comes from. And you can actually do that with any coal plant with the EIA database, which is kind of fun to play around with. But we send coal to a lot of states. Texas is one of the largest consumers of Powder River Basin coal, but obviously the Midwest and some other places as well. North Antelope Rochelle is the largest mine in the world. It's a Peabody Energy mine, roughly 90 square miles, a huge mine in the Powder River Basin, takes up a bunch of grasslands and prairie ecosystem in the Powder River Basin. So speaking to the Dave Johnson Power Plant specifically, so that's the mining side. There's also the power plant side. Money, workers, all of those things that, again, politicians really are trying desperately to hang on to for our state. So this is what happened because of all of this. I didn't create this, but I love it. I captured it on Twitter, and I don't know exactly where it came from, but it's, so we're a cowboy state. So here's a cowboy riding the coal torpedo into the ground. And that's essentially what our Wyoming legislature is these days, because here's what happened in 2020 during our legislative session. We passed the nation's only and hopefully last portfolio standard to require utilities to generate a portion of their power with coal with carbon capture. So most states have, a renewable energy portfolio standard, like, good goal, 20, 30, 50% of your power to come from, the wind, the sun. Wyoming instead has a portfolio standard that requires coal with carbon capture. You can read here why we've decided to do this, but yeah, essentially, you have to read the definitions to understand that dispatchable and reliable low carbon electricity is defined as coal with carbon capture under this bill. I would say too, on House Bill 200, it's the only piece of legislation. I've lobbied the legislature now for 15 sessions. It's the only bill I'm aware of where the sitting governor actually came to the committee to testify in favor of the bill. It was the governor's bill that year. Roughly 2/3 of both the House and the Senate passed it, and here we are. So now we're trying to figure out what to do to actually implement it. And in walks Glenrock Energy, who actually helped to write House Bill 200, go figure. They're a company that has a couple of oil fields nearby the Dave Johnson power plant. So this is what they're saying about carbon capture. It's been proven at scale. It's low cost, it's clean, right? This is directly from their website, which I really encourage you to go visit. I cannot explain this website adequately. You must go see it, Glenrock Energy. All right, and this is also what they say, and these are their words. Neat symmetry, captured carbon dioxide can be used to help produce low carbon oil, because apparently there is that thing. Reducing the net costs of installing carbon capture, somehow, and reducing the carbon footprint of the oil we still consume. So as you learned in the hydrogen panel, carbon capture isn't really about the environment, it's not about climate, it's about oil and producing more of it. So let's talk about the reality though. Glenrock Energy's oil fields, where they need this carbon source, which is the Dave Johnson power plant up the road, the oil fields they have actually went through bankruptcy twice. So they bought them in bankruptcy number 2. And of course, buying oil fields in bankruptcy really means taking over fields for liability purposes. So they didn't really pay for these oil fields. They would be enhanced oil recovery fields. So really to get, the oil that we already consume, this oil will actually stay in the ground without carbon capture. It won't be produced. And so it actually will create oil that wouldn't already be produced with carbon capture. And so here's what we're really focusing on. We're about to go into a contested case proceeding in our Utility Commission this coming week. And this is really what the utilities, in fact, are telling us about carbon capture. The first big issue is water. So I live in a state that gets about 12 inches of rain a year. Water is huge for us. You might have seen that picture of the power plant. There is a river that goes by the power plant. So there's water rights that are used for that power plant. Carbon capture would increase water consumption by 35 to 40%. Tremendous impacts for a state as arid as Wyoming. They would actually need to repurpose, it's a 4-unit power plant, they would need to repurpose water rights for the other 3 units to be used at unit 4 if carbon capture gets tacked onto the plant. Parasitic load, you often hear about this with carbon capture projects. It's a real issue. So up to 35% of the power generated would be used just for carbon capture. So if you have roughly a 100 megawatt coal plant, that means you're reducing the power output of that coal plant by like 33 megawatts. And therefore, you also have a need to get replacement power onto the grid for the generation capacity that you're losing because of carbon capture. So again, how this is a climate solution is really baffling in a lot of ways. Air pollution, it actually, carbon capture, because of that additional generation that's needed, often increases things like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, mercury, air toxics, all of the other issues that we've been trying to address in the power sector just increase with carbon capture. So you often hear again that this is clean coal, that this is good energy, and it really will have traumatic impacts for our health and safety in communities where coal plants are located if it's deployed. There's a risk about, so Dennis talked a lot about the 45Q program, which the IRA expanded and extended. But utilities actually have a risk of recapture of those tax credits if they, through monitoring and verification, if it's found that CO2 is leaking or not being sequestered adequately, there is actually a provision that requires utilities or whoever is doing a 45Q project to repay the tax credits. And this is a big risk for utilities and particularly customers of utilities that may have to have that penalty and liability going forward. Of course, capital costs, we're talking billion-dollar projects. In Wyoming, some of the utilities have said it's actually 2 to 3 times the original cost of the power plant. So, these are old power plants. Dave Johnson 4 turns 50 this year. So they didn't actually cost too much to build back when they were built in the 60s and 70s and maybe early 80s. And so the carbon capture capital is, again, 2 to 3 times the cost of the original coal plant. And that doesn't include things like the CO2 pipeline or the deep wells that you need to do to inject the carbon. That's just the capital cost of the capture system itself, not the sequestration end. And then increased operating and maintenance expenses as well. So again, these are older coal plants. They just take more money to run. So here's out of the utilities themselves. The mandate could spike monthly bills by $100. This is very significant, of course, for anybody who pays a power bill at your home. And one of the complicating factors here is that, again, we're a state of 550,000 people, and most of the power that we generate in state actually is exported to other states. So for instance, our largest utility, Rocky Mountain Power, is a subsidiary of a company called Pacificor. Pacificor sells power to 6 western states. It's actually the largest utility in the western US. And roughly 40% of Pacificor's customers live in Utah. About 30-some% live in Oregon. Oregon, Utah, Idaho, and Washington, so the other states in the system, do not want to pay for House Bill 200 and Wyoming's coal with carbon capture portfolio standard. So because it's a policy choice of our state, only our customers are on the hook for those bills. So that just makes it that much more expensive because there's only so many of us in Wyoming that can foot that billion-dollar bill for a carbon capture project. So the real issue then becomes, how long does it take to pay off one of these carbon capture projects? If you have a billion-dollar project that only a certain amount of ratepayers can pay for, you end up paying forever. And if you have to shut the coal plant down before the payoff, you end up with a stranded asset. So that's this poor gentleman in the boat. He's out in the water and stranded because he doesn't have enough utility customers to pay for his water or whatever it is that he needs. But and he's a stranded asset out there in the boat. So that's the real risk and the real concern I think we have in the state is going forward with some of these projects, getting some additional money in, and then not being able to pay it off in the long run, and ending up with a billion-dollar boondoggle that we'll be paying off forever. So there you go.
Thank you very much. Looks like we've got some time for Q&A. So let's get started. We have a microphone for people to use, and if you have a question, please give your name and where you're from first. And while people are thinking about questions, I want to start with a question for Dennis. You mentioned the issue of the percentage of carbon capture and how important it is to look at it over time. Can you give an example or describe a situation where there was a claim of carbon capture at a certain high level, but the reality was lower over time?
Well, the only real data we have are from the Boundary Dam facility, which is in Canada, and the Petronova facility, which was in Texas, both of which have operated. Well, Boundary Dam is still operational. It came online in 2015, and Petronova operated for 3 years. At points in their operational life, they captured 92% of the carbon dioxide that was being emitted. At more points in their life, they captured maybe 60% of the carbon dioxide that was being emitted. So the thing that we need to focus on is that the promise is that these facilities will get built and capture 90 or 95% of the carbon every day, 365 days a year, every year for 20 years. And that is just not going to happen. And in the two real-world examples we have, it hasn't happened. As Bruce said earlier, the Boundary Dam facility has greatly underperformed, and what they did was they changed the target. And so it actually looks like they're now closer to capturing what they said they were going to capture. The facility at Petronova underperformed by all of our calculations. They have danced around it in their official reporting at DOE by saying that they met their demonstration targets, which is true. But their demonstration targets were for like 3 months at a time or 6 months here. It wasn't for the 90% every day, every year for 20 years. And that just has not happened anywhere.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Great.
Hi, Sam Reynolds, IEEFA. It strikes me that the reason that so many of these stupid projects are actually happening and have happened is because the companies responsible for them bear none of the risks and the costs that we're talking about. Can you just talk a little bit more, maybe in respective markets, about where the actual costs are falling and who's on the hook for stranded assets like Petronova, and how much liabilities companies proposing these projects actually bear?
A lot of questions
included
in that one question of yours, Sam. Well, let's focus on Petronova for a minute. It cost $1 billion. They got $190 million in federal funds. They got a concessionary loan from the Japanese Import-Export Bank. I'm not sure, I don't know the exact title, but they got concessionary lending from that Japanese bank because the other half owner of Petronova is JX Nippon, which is obviously a big oil and gas firm in Japan. So the cost to build it was brought down significantly by those two components. The actual investment by NRG, which is the American firm that ran it and built it, they, I think, ended up investing $350 million in it. They wrote it all off within 3 years. And they just sold the plant for $3+ million to their co-partner, JX Nippon. So now this Japanese firm owns a closed carbon capture facility in Texas that is not operating and is actually attached to a power plant that is offline at least through March of next year. So, you know, was it a smart investment by that Japanese company because they got it for nothing? I don't know. It didn't work for the 3 years, really, in the sense that it was supposed to work at 90%. Clearly, this was a big risk that NRG took and lost. I mean, they wrote it all off. And the reason you haven't actually seen more of these going forward, at least in my view, is the companies that want to build them can't get financing for them because of the risks. Does that get most of your questions?
Yeah, and if I could just add too, I think that the Wyoming situation is the first one where we're actually seeing like utility customers potentially like directly on the hook for these projects in a very big way. And partly because our law authorized it in Wyoming differently. So of course, you know, no utility is voluntarily choosing carbon capture. It's X'd out in every utility planning model. Integrated resource planning does not select coal with carbon capture. But if required, then it becomes an environmental compliance obligation, and you can pass that on to ratepayers. So that, I think that is the real risk of the Wyoming situation. We were successful in the rulemaking process for House Bill 200 to provide an out for utilities. They have to, so our portfolio standard is silent. That's also sort of unique compared to, say, a renewable portfolio standard. So it has to be the highest possible standard under the law, but if utilities can show that it's not economic or technically feasible, then they can actually select zero as their portfolio standard. So that's what we're advocating for in these hearings that we're doing next week to basically try and give the utilities an out for compliance with House Bill 200. But that'll be, I think once it starts to hit people's pocketbooks, that's when I think the reality of this technology really comes home. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, obviously it's impacted taxpayers very significantly. The 45Q program has been, it's been millions of dollars that we've given away from the Treasury to this kind of program. So very significant on that end as well.
Putra, do you have a comment on that question? No? Okay. I'd like to, we have another question. Here we go.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rebecca Sale from the Property Rights and Pipeline Center. Not necessarily a question, but just wanted to point out some of the other challenges going on. That FERC has declaimed responsibility for the pipeline piece of CCS projects, and PHMSA can't comment on routing at all. So these are basically going to be unregulated pipelines. And Dennis, as you pointed out, people really don't want them in the Midwest already, where a couple of big projects are trying to go through. As you said, the farmers and the environmentalists are saying no. That a lot of that is because these projects are going to use eminent domain, which will be state-based, not federal, but still in all, a lot of these folks in the Midwest, the farmers, they understand this because of the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline. They've had this process before of eminent domain coming at them. And I think that's one of the major reasons now they're even saying they won't let people on to survey their property. And so, is that going to be another piece of pushing back? I think you're right. It's going to be almost impossible to build all the pipelines that they would have to build to make this work.
No, I really think the pipeline issue is it's over here. Nobody's paid any attention to it yet, but it's going to come to the fore really quickly if more projects are proposed. That's the whole, and I know Suzanne unearthed a whole bunch of very interesting data on a pipeline issue a little while ago where the farmers have very legitimate concerns about the ground is not restored to the pre-existing condition, so it's no longer useful as farmland. And so you have this pipeline on your farm and you cannot actually use it. And it just, they have the pipeline industry has a terrible track record.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's happened in Oklahoma with the midship pipeline, right? I mean, they washed everybody's topsoil away. Yeah. So you can't farm without that.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Fight from CL. And I have two questions that I couldn't think of a clever way to pretend are one, so I'm just going to go for it. But
well, first ask Putra one and ask me one, or ask Shannon.
Yeah. So first is just enhanced oil recovery is a huge driver of what's happening in the U.S., but it's not as big of an industry and a process outside the U.S., and I'm wondering if that is changing and if there's interest in developing enhanced oil recovery in other geographies. And then the second question is a bit more abstract, which is I've seen, in addition to the actual risk of CCS projects getting built, there's also a concern that the availability of CCS as an option that might allow coal and gas plants that otherwise would retire or make other kinds of utility planning decisions might enable them to continue their lives, even if they don't ever actually retrofit and install CCS. And I'm wondering if there's, just if you could reflect on that and if that sounds like a real threat or if it's not.
So let's go back to the first
I'll
question.
take the first one. EOR has a lot of history in the US because the US has a lot of tax credits behind it. The reason why it's not easy to develop it in other places is usually because it's expensive. So what's happening right now is that the word CCS is associated with green for some reason. And behind this, a lot of oil companies are negotiating to get a lot of incentives from many governments in emerging markets. And they're riding on the wave that the CCS was supposed to be part of the climate change, movement. So it's if you're asking whether it'll grow, I think it depends on which government will provide how much incentives to how to what extent, but it will remain expensive. And what we're trying to push as well is that we're trying to push the same narrative to the oil companies that if you're going to use it to storage, right? That's the least middle ground that we can do. Because if they're going to try to use it to do EOR, it's going to be worse. It's going to be worse for everybody. So, yeah. Dennis, you may want to answer something.
Well, one quick point on the EOR. At Petronova, NRG had estimated that they own an oil field that they were going to put the capture the carbon into and increase their production, and that's how they were going to pay for the investment. But they had estimated that it was going to raise production at this oil field to 15,000 barrels a day. So they started injecting it. It ended up raising production, but only to about 5,000 barrels a day. So clearly it worked, but EOR is not a magic bullet. It reacts differently in different oil fields and has different properties everywhere. So it's not, you can't just say, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to make all our money back. But so, that would be on the EOR side. On the extending the life, I think it's totally possible that it would allow people to try to extend the life. I will say that work that IEEFA has done, myself and Seth, I don't know if he's in the room, but we track the U.S. coal plants very, very carefully. And there's 200,000 megawatts of installed coal capacity in the U.S. right now. And we would tell you with a great deal of confidence that by the end of 2030, at least half of those will be retired. So we're now talking about 100,000 megawatts. But many of those also have retirement dates between 2030 and 2035. And the utility industry isn't moving as fast as I would want it to maybe, or anybody in this room, but they want out of coal. By and large, they're moving away. Wyoming's its own little case. West Virginia, it's its own little case. I get that. And there are a couple places like Prairie State in Illinois where you're going to get carbon capture attempts. But writ large, the utilities want out of coal, which is why, and I know Putra and I probably disagree a little bit, but that's why I'm focused a little bit more on natural gas and what happens there. Because I see the utilities in the U.S. moving away from coal, but not necessarily all of that installed gas capacity.
Thanks.
That help?
Yeah, because I think that gets at some of the new build gas plants that are not going to be built with carbon capture, but might be carbon capture ready or amenable or something like that.
Well, and it's greenwashing.
Yeah.
There was a huge proposal made in West Virginia a month ago, right after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, where a company called Competitive Power Ventures, which is an IPP developer basically in the PJM region in the middle part of the country, proposed building an 1,800 megawatt combined cycle gas plant in West Virginia. There's no such animal in West Virginia. It would be the largest gas plant in PJM. It would be the 7th largest gas plant in the entire United States. Oh, and they're going to put carbon capture on it. So yeah, you can announce anything you want, but I don't see that project happening.
Yeah, if I may add a little bit about, that's the thing with CCS is that it's a convenient tool to make a lot of delays. In many markets, like in Indonesia, we've seen some coal gasification plants which are supposed to be carbon capture ready. So it's kind of like get it over the wall, get the investment ready, and then we'll figure it out in the next 10 years. But the 10 years never come. So that's going to be convenient, and we're seeing that this is going to be more and more because people want to talk about it's going to be future compatible, and you just plug CCS into your prospectus and you're ready. So that's how it goes.
Okay, thank you. Going to ask for you.
Hi, I'm Autumn Hanna with Taxpayers for Common Sense. So from our
we needed you earlier.
Yes. So from our organization, so we've been working on CCS for our 25 years of existence, and one of the plants that I remember was FutureGen, right? And how much money we spent in Illinois. That was a significant federal investment. And a lot of the pushback we get, especially now, I think where the idea for climate is just more money anywhere and everywhere. And so the dollars and cents for CCS doesn't seem like a bad investment for folks. We should just put our eggs in every basket, so we have to continue down the CCS road, because I think they've been, as Putra mentioned, so successful at making it seem like a green technology. But one of the things back then that really had resonance, I think, among the public, and we did some events in Illinois with farmers, and were the sequestration sites and the risk of storing carbon too. So you have this cost risk that people were concerned with, but also this idea of putting carbon somewhere, storing it, and the pipelines, of course. And they moved where they were putting the carbon so many different times in Illinois with FutureGen because they couldn't find a place. So my question is, if you have looked into that at all or seen, like, we're just trying to figure out what's the message that's going to work here, and is talking about the risks of these sites and storing carbon and transporting carbon, is that something that you've put together in your research or have comment on?
If I knew the risks to focus on, I would be either really, really popular or really, really rich. But no, I think we have to focus on every one of the risks, because they make a different impression on different audiences. I mean, the financial risk is a clear and present risk, but it doesn't matter to the farmer. He's not financing the project, right? The pipeline risk is much more relevant for the farmer because it's his or her land, and they have a clear attachment and want to make sure that it's still there. There is the risk of liability going forward because the oil and gas industry will tell you it'll stay safely underground for hundreds of years. We have no proof of that. I mean, it hasn't been done. So they're all sort of part, I think they're all part of the solution or the
I just wanted to say, have you heard of the CCS indemnification? Because that's also something we fought against, and they do it for nuclear, and so the sort of accident case, is that something that you've come across?
I haven't seen that, but you were shaking your head, Shannon.
Yeah, I was going to say, in Wyoming, we just passed legislation this past session, and other states have done something similar where after site closure of a sequestration site, the state actually assumes liability. So, yes, exactly. I would say also there is a case in Wyoming that I bring up all the time because I'm old enough and have been doing this long enough to remember it. There's a school in Midwest Wyoming that actually was shut down for an entire year. It's in an enhanced oil recovery field, and the well next to the school leaked carbon, but it also leaked benzene with that because it is an oil field. And that actually caused toxic levels of emissions at the school. And so the school children had to be bused 40 miles that year to Casper to go to school. So that, I'm happy to send that article to anyone. I think it's really important to think of the consequences because CO2 is highly corrosive. If not stored properly, it will escape. It's not just in your soda. It can be very dangerous and can lead to toxic levels of emissions. We saw a pipeline burst outside in Louisiana in a community. If folks haven't heard that story, that was very significant and severe. So it can cause explosions and risks, and I think that's important to kind of think through as well. But again, I think whatever resonates with whatever audience you're talking to, it's a whole level of impacts, not just at the power plant, but all down cycle as well, and up cycle for coal mines too. So yeah, the whole cycle. Yeah.
Thank you. And you have another question?
Thank you to all the panelists. My name is Laura Carmel, and I'm with Global Witness. And I have a question about monitoring these CCS and hydrogen boondoggles, tax boondoggles. I don't know who used that term, but it seems a very apt one. So I think it's a question for Dennis. I haven't followed as closely all the details in the infrastructure and IRA bills, and I'm wondering if there are any guardrails built into this. Who's going to be measuring and verifying the capture rates and so on, or we're just going to take the company's word. I know that the previous version of 45K, there was a report by Treasury Inspector General, so maybe there will be more of that, or if not, do you see a role for external non-governmental watch, journalists and others to kind of hone in on how wasteful this is? Thank you.
Yes, there's a role for everybody to hone in on how wasteful it could be. I don't believe, and I won't swear to this because I haven't read, the energy section of the IRA is 775 pages, and I haven't read it all. And then the Jobs Act of the year before was even longer, I believe. I've not read every section of it. I don't think there's any mandated federal guidelines for, certainly the federal government's not taking on the verification and the monitoring going forward. And I actually will admit I don't know exactly how that's done. I know that there was some Treasury worry that they were paying out too much money and not getting enough, payment from the companies who were overclaiming their sequestration. How that's going to work going forward, I don't know. And I think it's going to boil down to individual states monitoring the wells and making sure that they're not leaking, because the federal government doesn't really have the capacity. And also we have this provision where states can get what's called primacy over the digging of, they're called Class 6 wells, which is where CO2 goes, and you can get the ability as a state to run your own program, supposedly to EPA standards. But once EPA gives you primacy, you get to run your own little program. And North Dakota has primacy now, and does Wyoming have primacy? Okay, those are the only two, but Texas is about to apply, and Louisiana is about to apply. And so it's going to come down to some states that want to support their oil and gas industry are going to seek this primacy so that they can monitor these developments more so than the federal government, which is potentially a problem.
Yeah, captured regulators, not captured carbon.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Nikki Reich from the Center for International Environmental Law. And thanks really for a session where I'm so happy to hear so many of the issues that we at CL at least have been talking about are shared by others in the room. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to just make a couple comments or draw out a couple things that I think don't get enough attention. One of them building on what you're just discussing now about basically the impossibility of tracing the money for carbon capture and actually holding the users of those subsidies accountable, what we've seen in the past. And something that the recent bill introduced in revising the terms of 45Q is to make it both a direct payment, not just a credit, and also transferable. And so I think that these issues just complicate our ability to trace who is actually claiming the credit and who has to show what to keep it and not be subject to recapture. And I appreciate your point, Shannon, about the recapture potentially raising problems for utilities, but I think more likely than not what we've seen is these things are just not enforced and that there isn't the capacity either on the EPA or the IRS side to actually trace this. And so the question related to that, I think, is about how much those elements in the tax credit in the United States, at least, are going to introduce and invite a market of private investment in this, this now direct cash payment that can be transferred endlessly and that has no end date and cap. So the amount of subsidies that can be paid has no ultimate cap. And whether you're already seeing indications in private capital markets or in private investors, we've been really focused on the public subsidy side, but that this becomes also a boondoggle and a cash cow for private speculators. And the second point was just to really underscore that I think not enough attention is paid to the fact that the IPCC, whose models and charts are often touted by proponents of CCS and other speculative technologies as saying we need these technologies, those models are premised on the same theoretical 90% capture that has never actually been proven in a sustained way in real life, and that I think we need to be calling that out more to say, let's not hang our hat on models that are premised on hypothetical outcomes, but rather reality. And finally, the SPM, the Summary for Policymakers, has a brilliant chart, if you haven't seen it, SPM point 7, that makes crystal clear that carbon capture and storage is among the highest cost, lowest mitigation potential options for reducing emissions by 2030. It's like right there in color, and there's no denying it. And so I think the idea that those lies, as you put up there on the slide, Shannon, are still being trotted out about this being a low-cost, effective technology. We just need to be better at debunking them across the board. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Other questions? I wanted to ask Shannon about, as you're bringing your message out to the public, what's resonating most?
I'm sorry.
As you bring your message about your concerns about carbon capture out to the public, what's resonating the most with people?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say a lot of it resonates, but the cost, of course, is very important for Wyoming. We're a very conservative state. Folks do care a lot about government subsidies, largely concerned about subsidized power and what that means, and a sustainable basis going forward for our nation. So, you know, I think that's been a real concern of a lot of folks, including very conservative audiences in our state.
Okay. And Putra, to the extent that you've been aware of media coverage on this issue in the areas where you've been active, have you seen any voices emerging among thought leaders in the media about this issue? Is anybody paying attention yet?
Supporting or?
Raising concerns, raising questions.
No. And that's the thing with Asia, is that everybody's talking positive stuff about CCS, mostly, for the most part. So that's a big role for the people to look at the cases in Australia in many cases. But mostly if we look at the talks in Asia, it's, besides IEEFA, it's all positives. So I don't know if that's good or bad.
Okay. Well, we've got another question.
Just a quick question. Nicole Dusek, I'm with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Putra, I was really interested in what you said about Japan potentially becoming a leader in exporting carbon emissions, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit in terms of what you're seeing there and what you see potentially happening and what we need to be on the lookout for.
Thank you. It's still a potential at this stage, but the leaning toward that is becoming clearer. It's so the way they're seeing the future, if you notice, this is going to be related with their future outlook on the hydrogen side and ammonia side. There's a lot of talks about importing hydrogen or ammonia while going back with a ship with the liquid carbon at the other end. So, rather than having an empty ship, you would rather have the ship, filled with liquid carbon dioxide. The danger in this discussion is that we're seeing some talks, again, this is still rumors, is that people are mentioning that let's ship it to Southeast Asia because the regulations is accommodating. What does accommodating means? It means that, who cares what's going to happen there, right? Regulation is going to be very lax. Who's scared? Who's going to take the risk? So that talks is ongoing. We're seeing a lot of push again from the Japanese side to incentivize regulation. On a positive note, though, they have been talking that if Japan's going to do that, they're going to start exporting CO2. then you guys can also use it at a lower cost. If you have a coal plant, you can just hook it up and then you can inject part of the emissions. So that's the basic premise of this. This is all still a basic discussion. It's still a potential, but the movement is there. It's brewing slowly because we're seeing some regulations starting to pop up here and there. And it's all the same companies, the same Japanese companies. Because I don't know how familiar you are, even Petra Nova is basically Japanese companies, right? Like Dennis just mentioned. It's Japanese technologies, so there's a lot of that interplay.
Yeah, I would say actually Wyoming has a partnership with Japan as well called J-Coal. And some of our Wyoming folks have been to Japan, and Japanese come to the Wyoming legislature and go around. So, I mean, Japan has been very active in the carbon capture space, and both, I would say, in Asia and in the U.S. So.
Well, I'm getting the time signal. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank our terrific panel today.